This is Kofi Time.
Human rights are not to be found in dusty legal libraries, but in the hearts and minds of human beings.
20 years ago, Kofi Annan was awarded, together with the United Nations, the Nobel Peace Prize. Regarded as one of the modern world's icons of diplomacy, what's his legacy today? How can we prepare for tomorrow based on his vision for a better world? Hello, I'm Ahmed Fauzi, and I had the pleasure and privilege of working with Kofi Annan, accompanying him on many missions around the world as one of his spokespersons and communication advisor. Today we will discuss human rights, the rights of all men, women, and children around the world. Rights that Kofi Annan truly believed in. In fact, he said when he received the Nobel Peace Prize, "Each of us," and I quote, "is fully worthy of the respect and dignity essential to our common humanity." And while much progress has been made in the last decades, yet abuses continue, sometimes on a massive scale. What would Kofi Annan do today in the face of these abuses and to bring the perpetrators to justice? To answer this question and more, I am so pleased to welcome my friend Zeid Raad Al Hussein on this podcast today. Zeid is the president of the International Peace Institute, headquartered in New York. He's also a member of the Elders, although he's not that old, the group of eminent global leaders working together for peace, justice, and human rights. Zeid Raad Al Hussein was the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, a general champion of international justice, a consummate diplomat, and a peacekeeping expert. Zeid, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Ahmed. I'm delighted to be here with you.
How did you meet Kofi Annan?
Well, I met him, it must have been at the end of October 1995, if I remember correctly. He had been sent by Boutros Ghali to be the new special representative of the Secretary General to oversee the transition of the international presence in Bosnia-Herzegovina from being a UN to a new form of presence. And when he arrived, that first week, I didn't see much of him. After the first week, he asked to see me. He was meeting with all of the immediate staff. And I found him, as we always sort of knew him, someone who had very warm qualities, very human qualities. Although, admittedly, in the beginning, I wasn't intimidated by him because he didn't say very much. And I think within 3 or 4 days after my meeting, there was a reception somewhere in Zagreb thrown by our African colleagues in the UN. And I went along and Kofi Annan was there. And the music started and our African colleagues were starting to dance and Kofi started to dance. And I thought, wow, this guy's all right.
In fact, he did love music, and he played the drums himself.
It wasn't very long before we all not just wanted to work with him, we wanted to be with him. He had this uncanny ability to be direct and not be offensive, something that very few people can do. Either you're so indirect, you're not getting the point across, or you're too direct and you cause offense. And he had this amazing way of speaking to people. And he wouldn't beat around the bush, but he wouldn't make them react in such a way that the meeting was over. So I quickly developed an affection for him, and that lasted for the next few decades. And we became, I think, quite close.
I remember he always used to say, "There's no peace without development. There's no development without peace. And there's no lasting peace or sustainable development without respect for human rights and the rule of law. What struck you most about his approach to human rights?
Well, I think he was stung by the experiences of Srebrenica and Rwanda. He was the head of peacekeeping when, under his Secretary Generalship, the two seminal reports emerged, one on Srebrenica and one on Rwanda, the Carlson report. I mean, to his enormous credit, he didn't try and dodge the bullet, didn't try and evade responsibility. He acknowledged that that his department, had failed, and the mission had failed, and the UN had failed, and I think he was filled with remorse for that, to feel that he had a certain responsibility there, and to overcome it, or to position himself in a moral frame which would have been the correct one, was made easier by the fact that he had gone through that rather traumatic experience. And I think it motivated him to be the person and Secretary General that he became. I think it was something very deep inside him that motivated him to think in these terms, and to be a champion for the Human Rights Court.
But let's move on to the Human Rights Council, which was a major element of a package of UN reforms which were adopted at his initiative. The objective was to replace the Commission on Human Rights that had become discredited because of its politics and its politicization. However, 15 years later, the Council seems to be plagued by some of the same problems, and some believe it's not fulfilling its role to promote human rights and address gross and systematic violations. Do you think Kofi Annan's vision was realized?
Well, yes, I think you're right in saying that there was a broad sense, I mean, especially in the United States, that the Human Rights Commission was overly preoccupied with the Israeli-Palestinian file and wasn't spending enough time on other issues. It used to meet once a year for a period of about a month. And the Human Rights Council attempted to correct this by, first of all, meeting 3 times a year, and meeting throughout the year as a result of this newly created peer review system, which is the only one of its kind in the UN. And although it has its critics, it is amazing that you have a system which is universal like that, and everyone is involved. Not one country has withdrawn from it. The Human Rights Council does retain members who really ought not to be on the council. And we've seen in recent weeks, of course, the ejection of Russia from the Human Rights Council. That could also have been applied to a number of other countries who were really had no business to be on it, given the serious violations that they were perpetrating against their own people. And the General Assembly should be more active on that. On the other hand, the Human Rights Council is a political body. It can and it will never be morally consistent, and it's difficult. But there again, Ahmed, I used to always say these intergovernmental bodies, they're a reflection of the world out there. If the world is in a terrible state and rather pathetic state, these bodies also tend to be a reflection of that. And if the world is seeing improvements, then you'll find the same in these bodies. I think Kofi's, the package of proposals that we debated and then we approved in 2005 were critical because they not only dealt with the human rights architecture, which I think by and large is still something hugely important. No country has withdrawn from that architecture. Even the Trump administration, when it withdrew from the Human Rights Council, it still submitted its UPR, its Universal Periodic Review, at the end of Trump's term. And no matter what the member states say about human rights, none have withdrawn from the treaties that they've signed up to, and all have signed up to at least one. So if if it's so terrible in the eyes of some, why haven't they withdrawn? Not that we'd want them to, but they don't because they are locked into it. So I think what he achieved was hugely important.
And that leads me to the fact that you also served as the president of the Assembly of State Parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Kofi was also instrumental in the adoption of the statute and the creation of the court, but it's been criticized by some over the years for being, for example, biased against Africans. And Trump, former US President Trump, in 2020 imposed sanctions against the court's officials. What is your assessment of the impact of the ICC?
Well, you have to weigh its position against a few thousand years, tens of thousands, maybe 200,000 years of unrestrained human behavior, much of it criminal in the context of conflict. And we're trying to modify that behavior, change it by statute, as a result of a law that's written, absorbing custom and tradition in terms of where you do not commit outrages in respect of others who have surrendered in war. In other words, international humanitarian law, or where civilians are considered to be protected persons. As we emerged out of the Cold War, I think we believed sincerely that we are going to achieve something historic and see it cemented in place quite quickly. Kofi, as you rightly point out, was there in Rome. He was there to celebrate the adoption of the statute. When I was appointed in 2002 to basically build the court after it entered into force in July of that year, Kofi was there for the inauguration of the court, was there for the inauguration of the judges. He also played a very critical role in pushing the United States back when 2 years after the court was created, the Americans tried to have this resolution, the initial resolution was 1422, adopted again in the Security Council. The resolution basically sought to exclude all U.S. nationals from the remit of the court. And if it wasn't adopted by the Security Council, the U.S. would basically cut its support for UN Peacekeeper. It was almost blackmail. Yeah. That first year in 2002, 15 countries supported the resolution. The following year, the two states parties to the Rome Statute, France and the UK, abstained. And the third year, so now we're talking about 2004, it was the US came again with their resolution wanting it to be adopted. And Kofi at a Security Council lunch basically urged the council not to adopt the US resolution. And the Americans couldn't and didn't succeed in acquiring 9 votes. It was amazing. I mean, first of all, that the Americans couldn't do it, but also they couldn't do it because the Secretary General stood in their way. And he provided the cover then for the elected members not to support and defended the court in that way. And it was really a testimony to him. He just wasn't willing to stay quiet, and he stuck his neck out. And the rest of us were immensely grateful to him for taking this position in defense of the court. And I don't think I couldn't at the time remember a resolution like that where the Americans had proposed it and couldn't secure enough votes for it.
Yes, and this ability of his determination to stand for what was right and stand up to the big powers got him into trouble eventually.
Yeah, I think he sort of understood in a intimate way that when you're Secretary General, you build credit with the P5, but then you must also be seen to be spending it by the rest, because then how on earth are you going to, use a combination of charm, persuasion, and sometimes pressure to convince other smaller countries to do the bidding of what is in the interest of the collective good or the collective whole. And he sort of understood that, and he was able in his own way to push back. And yet, I'd go to a summit, for instance, and when he walked into the room, all the heads of states went up to him. He may have annoyed them at times, but they would all go up to him, and I think they respected him and his personal qualities, and he was standing up for justice. In the end, the court, I'm absolutely sure, will be successful. That it goes through teething pains, and people will complain about it. Well, certainly, that's almost, it should have been expected. I think we were too naive in expecting it to happen and be successful too quickly. But there is no alternative to it. The alternative is sheer chaos, and the fact that it has dampened at least the possibility of even worse crimes taking place, I think is also appreciated. So I'm still hopeful about it.
Yes. Kofi Annan's legacy also included the promotion and wide acceptance, finally, by the international community of what became known as R2P, the responsibility to protect. He used to say, and I quote, "The sovereignty of states must no longer be used as a shield for gross violations of human rights." Are we seeing today a return to the era of the Treaty of Westphalia, where each country can hide behind its sovereignty to do whatever it wants to its citizens?
Well, this is the opinion of some, although it's hard to maintain this because there's a whole category of laws and regulations that once adopted by an international body become hard law. For instance, there's a category of regulation adopted by the International Civil Aviation Organization, which once the matter is taken up and passed, it becomes hard law in all countries. Immediate. It's not negotiated, debated in national assemblies or parliaments. And the reason is that none of us want to step on a plane that then collides into another plane. So we accept that once the regulation is passed, and I believe these are safety regulations, they're implemented immediately. No question about sovereignty, and second guessing. So if it's possible there, why is it so difficult then to, accept that when it comes to the most extreme of human behavior, that somehow this is regulated internationally, to prevent the worst instincts in us from taking over? I mean, I would always ask the question, of my students, why do you think we need law? Why do we need law? Well, we have law because we're so unreliable. We're so untrustworthy as a species. And so we need to constantly remind ourselves that we have to do the right thing. And Kofi, by speaking in forceful terms about, the responsibility to protect, was really emphasizing the word responsibility, that you as a head of state or government have a responsibility to your people, to protect your people, not to protect the elites, not to protect those who are benefiting from, the largesse of the state at the exclusion of other ethnic, religious minorities. And protect all your people. And if you're not willing to protect your people, at some stage, other measures need to be taken. Of course, there should be mediation before that, every attempt to get you to change your way. But ultimately, of course, the intervention may be required. And that, in any case, exists in law. Because if there's a genocide, those who can intervene ought to intervene to prevent it. So I think he realized the responsibility of power, and he was speaking to it, and he wasn't shy to say it. And of course there was strong pushback, but he wouldn't have been doing his job if there wasn't any pushback.
Yeah.
And indeed, many years later, when I used to take long walks with him around Fune, where we both used to live in Switzerland, and I would say to him, Kofi, every time I say something, there's a lot of grumbling, and he would smile and in this sort of rather sort of impish way, and he would say, well, let them grumble.
Let them grumble, indeed. In fact, I was going to ask you, Zeid, you were fairly blunt and outspoken as the High Commissioner for Human Rights. In fact, you upset quite a few governments and earned the admiration of human rights non-governmental organizations. During those years when he was still with us, on those long walks, did you ever consult him about your mandate?
Yeah, we would talk a great deal. Usually it was on a Sunday. We would contact each other, and then there was this walk that we always did together. The walks were not that long because he would walk so fast. I mean, what I think was so stunning to me when I heard about his demise was I was completely taken aback because I didn't think he was in any ill health. I mean, he walked the pants off me, and I'm 20 years younger than he was. And we would ruminate a great deal, and we would talk about his secretary generalship and leadership. And we would talk about the work that I was doing. And we would admire nature. There was this wonderful part of the walk where he always would stop. And then there was this winding road down through these fields where you had Lake Geneva and the mountains. And he would always stop. It was, for me, I cannot but associate that view with Kofi. He would always stop.
Yes.
And we'd always admire the view together.
Yeah.
And he, he was very reflective, always kind. The overwhelming feeling I have about Kofi in all the years that I've known him was that he was so fundamentally decent. He was a decent human being. What I felt always was a sort of warmth and a feeling in all of us that this is the man we wanted to work for. This is the man we wanted to be with. If he came back successful from a trip, the staff would be out there wanting to cheer him on. And he brought in us a feeling that we wanted to be in the organization and we wanted to work for him, whether you're an ambassador or whether you're a staff member. And I think that is a very rare quality in people, and especially young people, I think, were drawn to him. It was really quite amazing. I think he again had a way of connecting to people, which wasn't sort of false or wasn't contrived. And one ought to not also forget that, he was a career staff member, unlike so many others. He was the only Secretary General who was a career staff member. And so he understood the organization sort of intimately and understood what it could possibly achieve. I think he had also a very subtle understanding of what motivates people and what gets them interested. And I used to love, and this is something I think he borrowed from his own West African culture, when he used to invite a motley group of people to dinner, and we'd all sit around the table, and people with very varied backgrounds and ages. And I'm sure you remember this, Ahmed. He would say to each of us, okay, so what did you do in the last couple of weeks? And the rather stunned, invitees, or at least those who'd never experienced this before, were stunned. One by one, we'd all be telling him what we did. Someone went on a bicycle ride across, a particular country. Someone else had, baked a cake or whatever it may be. We all went around the table, and then he would say with this big grin, okay, you, and you, let's focus on what you did. And then he would say, he'd play the chief, and then we would have this amazing discussion about all manner of things. And, he had this style. He had the Secretary General's mansion on Sutton Place here in New York. And I remember during the Iraq crisis, he would call me up and call up a number of people, and we'd go over to his residence. And usually there was a collection of people from the Secretariat, maybe one or two of us diplomats. And we would sit there and talk about issues, talk about Iraq, and talk about the problems he was facing. And so he very much made you feel that you belong to an organization where we're all striving to achieve the common good, where it's not everyone pursuing a narrow interest, national interest at the expense of others, but everyone actually thinking about the collective good. And I think that's the sort of inspiration that the world really needs. The voice also. He had this lovely voice sometimes, and we knew he was feigning it because he told me he was doing it where he'd speak softly at meetings and you'd be craning your neck to hear what he was saying. And of course, it was all deliberate so that we'd all stay extra quiet while he speaks. He was crafty like that, very shrewd. And so really, in the end, a lovely human being, and someone who I think was seen by all of us with deep affection. We were proud to work for him, work with him, be considered to be a Kofi person. And we miss him, terribly, I think. And in these days, I can only imagine quietly he would be, fuming at the abject sort of way in which those politicians around the world who ought to be doing more to lift all of us out of these, crises, pandemic, climate change, and are not really carrying the load the way that people expect them to. And I think he would be very frustrated and be speaking out, I think, more than ever before.
Zeid, thank you for sharing your thoughts and these stories with us and helping us understand better how Kofi Annan sought to protect the human rights and dignity of all human beings, and what his legacy means for those who try to do the same today. You've been listening to Kofi Time. Wherever you are, please share the values that Kofi Annan represented that you think are relevant today using #KofiTime. Kofi Time is brought to you by the Kofi Annan Foundation and the United Nations Information Service in Geneva. Produced by Gianluca Alaria. Join me again for the next episode of Kofi Time.